Right. We're a team of between 4 and 6 people, and we're currently working in 18 countries around the world. And the ones you didn't mention are countries like Kenya, Australia as well, where rainfall or contamination of water is a big issue. And I think a picture tells 1,000 words. Cities have traditionally not been very good at responding to water. This great divide between development and water, and very lack of integration of water. And what we've been doing is looking at ways that water, certainly water management, can be integrated. Now, when we talk about water as a practice, we don't use the term sustainable drainage or water integration. We talk about water sensitive or water responsive design. So we're working on schemes here in London, for example, where there's development in floodplains, where actually through development we can improve the situation rather than make it worse. Now, we have many projects around the world. I've been asked, with the time I've got, to speak about one. So given the choice of all the projects we could have talked about, Bermuda's water-sensitive designs, we've chosen a sponge city development in China. And the reason I've chosen that is because the Chinese approach to designing new cities is to design from an infrastructure point of view. So starting with the infrastructure and then looking at all the buildings and the transport systems that go around it. The Innovation Park in Gui'an, which is a new district of China, really started back in 2007 with the Innovation Park in Watford. And up until that point, the Innovation Park in Watford had just been a collection of buildings. It was really just about the building technology, how energy efficient was the building, what materials went into the building. Those are all worthy issues, but the issue of how does the building integrate with this environment really hadn't been considered. So we proposed an approach that looked at what could the landscape do to contribute to the building's efficiency, the building's water management, and also the building's energy demand. Because there's a lot of energy tied up in water. You know, we have to pump it, treat it, return it to the water table, pump it out of the water table, back to people's houses. If you can short circuit that process, recover rainwater where it falls, use rainwater where it's available, that reduces the flood impact, and it also starts to reduce the flooding within the city. So from there we went to the Innovation Park Scotland, Europe's largest development site on the former Ravenscraig Steelworks, a 450 hectare site. And we said, what would a water sensitive design look like in this part of the world? How would we deal with flooding? How would we deal with integration of sewage systems, water management systems? And this is a model that was designed as a blank canvas, as opposed to the Innovation Park in Watford. And that was important because we were looking at all the issues to do with contaminated land, how water migrates through contamination, and how can we deal with those issues through biofiltration, through landscape systems. Then we went one step bigger. We had a visit from the Chinese Premier to the Innovation Park in Watford, and he said, we want to have one of these in China. We want to show a way forward with managing our water resources in China, which is becoming a big issue. So this was a master plan. We didn't jump straight to this. There was many iterations of this. But essentially what we were saying is water is a great climate control mechanism as well. We can use evaporative cooling. We can use thermal mass in water to actually create better microclimate for cities. And most people focus on water, and flooding. And we're looking at all the things that water contributes, not just to biodiversity, but to air quality as well. And when we developed this master plan, the client said, this lake here, it'll never fill up. We just don't get enough rainfall in Beijing. It'll just take years to fill up, and we can't afford to pump potable water into that lake to fill it up. So we're not going to build that lake. We're going to cut that out of the program for the Innovation Park. And we've done a lot of work on how that would work, how the filtration systems, biofiltration, flood management would work. And they said, no, we don't need it. 2 months later, this happened in Beijing. Literally 2 months after we'd finished the design of the project. Beijing had its worst flooding for 50 years. There were lives lost, huge infrastructure cost. And we said to the client, look, if you'd had this scheme, that would have given the water somewhere to go. You would have had somewhere for that water to expand into, to take the flood impact out of that development. So they said, okay, we get it now. We get it, what you're talking about. And just literally a year later, at China's Green Building Conference, the president of China, Xi Jinping, said, we must start developing cities like sponges. And fortunately, in China, their leaders are very well-educated engineers. They understand how cities work, and they have a lot of people around who listen. When the president says something, they do it straight away. Sometimes without thinking, sometimes too quickly, sometimes without looking at the issues very carefully. And that's where we came in, to start looking at how their cities could respond to flooding, could respond to climate, could respond to better urban planning. And we have an innovation park network across the world. When I say we, I'm talking about in my capacity as an associate of the BRE, as an advisor on environmental design for new cities. And we've been looking at cities in different climate zones all around the world. So those range from right up the north in Canada, right down to the subtropics in Brazil. We have innovation parks in Toronto, Portland, China, Beijing. We wanted to have an innovation park built in an area that experiences extreme rainfall events. So the subtropical regions of China, particularly in the western provinces of China, experience extreme rainfall events. But on the other hand, water is one of their greatest assets. They have the cleanest water in all of China. So we were targeting Western China, and at the same time, China was developing a new city there, a new city called Gui'an. It's a merger of two cities, Gui'an and Anshun, and it's an area of 1,700 square kilometers. And it's to be built in this kind of environment. Yeah, exactly. Wow. I heard someone say wow. Because one of the key things is, what kind of impact does a city have in that kind of landscape, in that kind of environment? That's not exaggerated. The mountains literally come straight out of the ground like that. And the traditional approach to designing a city like that in China would be just to flatten the ground and start with a blank canvas. And we said, this is not the way you deal with hydrology. Hydrology is one of the greatest drivers of the master plan. And that's what I teach my students at the University of Greenwich. If you want to develop a good master plan, start with terrain, start with landform, start with hydrology, because those are the key influences on urban design. This is the kind of environment that we have in Guizhou province in China. It's at the head of the Pearl River, which flows into Shanghai. So anything that happens here migrates right the way down to the cities, right the way down through the country. And this is the master plan for the city. It's huge, but it also has significant amounts of green space. These are your mountains that pop right out of the landscape, literally like a bubble out of the landscape. And it's very important that they remain part of the character of the area. One of the things that China is doing, on a side note, is to try and make all the cities in China not carbon copies of each other. That you go to a city in a different part of China and you understand the culture of that place. So there's a lot of issues that we're looking at apart from just water, looking at culture of place, looking at the landscape and the landform, and how the water strategy works for that city, how we use those green spaces as a sponge. And we have a series of water parks through the city. But one of the issues with Chinese master planning is it's really grid-based. They literally take the area of the city and they just divide it up into functional zones. And what we find very frustrating, which is something we deal with in the UK very well, is this idea of mixed use. Because they have this compartmentalized view of the city. There's the housing, there's the industrial zone, there's the commercial zone. And we're saying, look, you need an integrated approach, you need a variety of scales in order to implement sustainable drainage. So one of our key challenges with the Gui'an Innovation Park was to say, how do we deal with terrain? How do we deal with mixed use? How do we deal with the topography in a way that enhances the city's ability to deal with water management? This was our site, and we said, let's not start bulldozing the terrain. Let's actually work with the terrain. Let's work with the hydrology of the site as it stands. Let's look at how the water moves across the space. What does that tell you about where we need to infiltrate? Where do we need to intercept pollutants? And One of the great things about the collaboration is we were collaborating with Tsinghua University in Beijing, which is like the Oxford University of China. It's like the top academics in the country. And we had an opportunity to kind of compare approaches from an academic-based approach to a practical approach. You know, somebody like me who's not an expert on hydrology, but I know a lot about how the environment works and how that can be integrated into the water management strategy. A lot of arguments, a lot of late nights, a lot of debating integration issues, particularly with things like urban diffuse pollution. Because one of the big challenges, one of the big risks of sponge cities is it's great to get the water into the ground, but you don't want the pollution in the ground with it. So we've got to intercept that pollution on the surface and deal with it. And that's one of the big missing links in sponge cities in China is it's great to put the water in the ground, but how do you deal with contaminants? How do you prevent vectors of pollution getting into the groundwater? So we looked at how the landscape could actually migrate through this new urban form. How do we use that landscape as part of the sponge, as part of the absorption of not just floods, but of contaminants as well? And a lot of that was to do with cut and fill and effectively minimizing cut and fill. So we wanted to do some manipulation of the terrain, but we didn't want to effectively transform it into a flat plateau. So these were showing how we can have minimal interventions, minimal changes in level from the existing, so we weren't creating, you know, a brand new surface for the landscape. And how we could create functional zones within the park. Remember, this is a demonstration. It's not a real city. But what we're doing is laying down a foundation for how their real cities can be designed. So we want to get visitors around the park and explain to them what's important about design with nature, designing with water. And there's a lot of stuff that's gone into the park in terms of renewable energy. And again, as I pointed out, water and energy are very much related. They go hand in hand. If you can save water, you can save energy as well. We looked at developing buildings which were passive and buildings which were water responsive. They both recycle their water, but they use things like ground source heat, labyrinth cooling systems, passive ventilation. And water is very much a part of the strategy of the building's efficiency, but also a big part of the building's passive credentials. Evaporative cooling from water changes urban climate. Say we are learning, I mean that in a way that it's a two-way street. China are learning from our approaches to water management. We're learning about technology that China is developing for water management and renewable energy systems. The master plan for the park was developed as a research platform, and this center here is all about education. Because again, traditionally with eco-cities in China, they move the local people out and they bring in, you know, a whole new community. And we said, hold on, that existing community is a really good base for creating a new teaching regime. Upskill those people into people who will be the future of maintaining these systems or building these systems on buildings. So again, teaching and training is very much a part of the technology. That's a visualization of what the park should look like, and that is exactly what it does look like today. Something very interesting that you'll notice in some of the photos is these are traditional tea plantation terraces. This is literally where they grew tea and other fruits in the environment. And rather than obliterating those and getting rid of them, we actually incorporated them into the master plan. And what's unique about that is terraces are a fantastic way of biofiltration of water. They slow water down. That was their whole purpose. They slow the water down and they give you stages of treatment. So the vegetation regimes there go from macro to micro particulate interception in the park. That's a very complicated way of saying they're really effective at removing surface contamination. And that's a key thing for all of these sponge cities, is removing surface particulates and pollution. So this is, you can see the park here. This is an actual Google Earth photo of the park, which was literally taken about a month ago. And you can see all of these terraces around the city where this new city is going to be built. And what we've said to the government is, don't obliterate those. They're an important part of the culture, but they're also a very effective means of intercepting water runoff. And we can use them. We can use them in the implementation of this new city. And they've listened, thankfully. So you can see the terraces here within the Innovation Park retained as an important part of the water management system. And you can see the park's relationship to what is effectively a new city. So these are the new government offices. They're the first people to move into the eco-city, the management, the governance of the city. And they're right next door to this Innovation Park. So they understand the importance of these hydrology management practices, these good practices that we're putting in to conserve the environment, to conserve the landscape heritage of China. And I think there's some good examples that we've learned from that we can actually bring back to the UK as well in terms of landscape as heritage. What's interesting about those things we're learning in China is we're bringing those ideas back to the UK as well. So this is the Natural History Museum in London, which, as many of you will probably know, it has a very bland, very destroyed landscape environment around it. You've got ice rinks, you've got butterfly houses, and they just re-turf it every year. That's all going to change because the Natural History Museum is moving forward so that the landscape becomes part of the exhibition. And one half of the scheme to the east is about everything that's happened up until now in the Earth's history, the last 4.5 billion years of the Earth's history. The western half of the museum becomes what is the future? What is the future of man's existence in the city from here going forwards? And these are the opportunities we have. So you might recognize the terraces. These are food production terraces in the museum. We're talking about urban food, quality of life, health and well-being, microclimate. These are also important issues. So although we focus on flooding with water, we have to realize that water also brings a whole host of other benefits as well to urban environments. And that's something that we're trying to capture. It's something we feel is a really good collaboration between academics, practitioners, designers, developers, all around the world. And this collaboration is something that we're trying to see happen in developments in the UK, as well as retrofit opportunities for water management in our cities. Because as we know in the UK, we're not building many new cities, but we do have a lot of existing problems in our existing cities that have to be tackled as equally well as what's happening in China. China's doing things on a massive scale, but the UK has to make a very big change as well in the way we deal with water. The really exciting opportunity that's really just landed on our desk in the last week or so is we've now been asked to develop and design the water management strategy for the Eden Project China, which is going to be in Qingdao province. It's very new. We've just put together the ideas for the submission. And it's a big opportunity because, again, that is something that started here in the UK. It's something that started about looking at the environment holistically that's moving to China. We're taking that thinking to China, and there'll be lessons learned in China from this that we'll also bring back to the UK, and we'll take it to other projects around the world that we're doing as well. So it's a great opportunity. This is a collaborative network. It's communication, it's talking, but also it's doing. And one thing we have to get across to China, it's very difficult to get across on many occasions, is when you're innovating, you will make mistakes. No doubt about it. But it's better to do something and do it wrong and learn from it than to do nothing at all. And that's the situation we're facing around the world. We must do something. Time to stop talking, time to start doing. And if we learn along the way, that's a great thing. Thank you.